too many slides. It's all with too much text. But some of it I can go through pretty quick. One excuse I have for too many slides is that I'm really covering two different issues. So one's plutonium pit production, the other's cleanup. Now, having said that, in the case of Los Alamos, the need for cleanup, which by the way is not happening, but is largely due to plutonium pit production to begin with. So Susie is going to woman the slides, and you go ahead and move right along. Some of these I'm going to move through very quick, but I always like including this slide, which is actually a Los Alamos lab slide, because if you were to read their newsletter, you wouldn't know that they work with nuclear weapons. They talk about working on AIDS or climate change or something, and all of this stuff is infinitesimal compared to their annual 2.6 budget. I should add, save questions and perhaps write them down so you don't forget them. The problem, problem is we're filming there too. Yeah.
You know what? But we can twist it.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm trying to stay out of the way of the camera.
Could he lower that?
Yeah, you got a request to lower the mic. Is that possible?
I suppose, trying to get the best recording
Yeah.
I can.
Would you still be in camera if you went?
If you went over towards Susie?
Yeah.
Yeah, you will.
Yeah, go.
Well, the other way.
Me go. Okay.
You're
All right,
good.
we in the sweet spot.
Can everybody see
I
the
was
slides
skiing
now?
with a guy today, and on the tips of his skis, he had arrows pointing this way, but one ski said sweet, and the other ski said spot. I don't know. I just think that's funny. But I'm in the sweet spot now. Okay. Moving along. Again, despite all the hype that you hear about Los Alamos, by their own admission, that's the central mission of Los Alamos. It's nukes, you know. That's their raison d'etre. By the money, and I like to describe myself as my politics is of the Watergate school, which means follow the money. Or like Bob Dylan said, money doesn't talk, it swears. So follow the money, and strictly by the money, out of Los Alamos' annual $2.6 billion budget and rising, a full 70% of it is for core research and production programs for nuclear weapons. So despite the fluff that you hear, and much of the 30%, well, all of the 30% either directly or indirectly supports the nukes. And as an example, I've always had an interest in earth science. And one day I went to, just on the website, to the lab's earth science department, and it's a non-weapons program, but I get into it, and what it was about, earth science, was about the geologic impacts of earth-penetrating nuclear weapons. So that's Los Alamos for you. Okay, moving along. We got a $1.7 trillion so-called modernization going on. And, you know, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is going to be 50 years old this year. And the key bargain in the Non-Proliferation Treaty was that the weapon states promised to negotiate in good faith global disarmament, in exchange which the non-weapon states promised to never acquire them. So of course we're not doing that, and I'm going to the United Nations in late April for the 50th review conference. But instead of that, honoring that pledge, we now have a $1.7 trillion modernization program, which started under Obama, okay? You can't blame one party on this. It started under Obama and has metastasized to 1.7 trillion. What that buys, first of all, it's a complete rebuilding of every existing type of nuclear weapons in the planned stockpile. There's 8 different types. It's also a complete rebuilding of the production complex, and that's only a third of the money. The other 2/3 is in the Defense Department. It's the heavy bombers, which, by the way, the costs for the future heavy bomber are classified. The costs are. But it's a new heavy bomber, new missiles, et cetera, et cetera. I want to briefly touch on a policy point. You know, I'm of the age that I was 11 years old when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. It scared the shit out of me. But we've always heard that the purpose of our nuclear weapons stockpile is to deter others. Well, that's only half of the equation. The reality is both Russia and the US, we both have a couple of thousand nukes ready to go. And you don't need a couple of thousand nukes just for the sake of deterrence. What we really have are plans for actual nuclear war fighting. That's why we have a couple of thousand. And in fact, we single targets are targeted with 2 or 3 warheads, not just one warhead. So when you hear, the next time you hear that the stockpile is all about deterrence, you won't hear this from very many people, but remember my words, it's much more than that. It's about actual war fighting. Briefly on what a pit is. I went to Russia one time, I had a fact sheet translated. I'm looking at my crowd of my audience of Russians, and they have a very, puzzled look on their face. But to get to my point, and it was a university professor that translated it, but she translated pit as like a hole in the ground. And in this case, a pit is like the pit of a peach. It's the very core of modern nuclear weapons. They're out of plutonium because they can be lightweight relative compared to a uranium pit. And the plutonium itself is a trigger that induces radiation. It ignites the secondary, which, as I put it, puts the H in H bomb. So briefly, that's what a pit is. Now, the government's proposal is to expand plutonium pit production. The official level, as it is right now, is 20 plutonium pits per year at Los Alamos. And it's very important to note that there is no pit production scheduled, and there hasn't been any scheduled, to maintain the safety and reliability of the existing stockpile. It's all about future speculative weapons. We already have 20,000 existing pits at the Pantex plant, which is about 11 miles outside of Amarillo, Texas. In 2006, an independent study concluded that pits last at least a century. Just to give you an idea of what I do, that study came about because I asked then Senator Jeff Bingaman to require it. And he successfully did so as a floor amendment to the 2004 Defense Authorization Act. And that made a lot of difference. Following that, Congress canceled a new design warhead called the Reliable Replacement Warhead. But now, they keep changing the rationale for new pit production. And the essential rationale, and I'm speaking of the Department of Defense and then the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is in the Department of Energy, it boils down to we need 80 pits per year because we say so. That's what it boils down to. They never give a good technical justification for why expanded pit production is needed. So we've gone through 2 proposed new design nuclear weapons in the last decade. And they have all been the programmatic driver of expanded pit production. I'm quite proud to say that the collective activist community over the last decade has defeated proposals for 2 new designs. But now the situation is the most serious, and the latest rationale, and I know I can get a little too in the weeds, but it's for this new warhead for the Air Force's intercontinental ballistic missiles. But all along, my underlying point here is that the federal government is really squirrely about the need for pit production. They're like Jell-O and keep coming up with different rationales when we're talking about something that's going to cost a minimum of $43 billion over the next 30 years. A real important thing to know that I want to stress is that these future pits will not be exact replicas of existing pits. And the reason this is a problem is a plutonium plutonium pit is spherical, and it's surrounded by high explosives, and it has to implode like perfectly symmetrically. So you gotta test them. But we are talking about future heavily modified designs, and we can't test them because of the global testing moratorium, or alternatively, it could push the U.S. back into testing, which you can imagine how, imagine being Kim Jong-un and the U.S. starts testing, so all hell would break loose. There were independent experts that really panned the Fed's plan on pit production. And in short, the Fed's plan is 80 pits per year by 2030. It'll be 30 or more at the Los Alamos National Laboratory just down the road. It'll be 50 or more at the Savannah River site, which is in South Carolina. But these independent experts, I should add that the Department of Energy has been on the Government Accountability's Office high-risk list. Those are that's a formal title, high-risk list, for 27 consecutive years for project mismanagement. So the feds that are doing this basically have the worst track record of all in proper stewardship of taxpayers' money. They're just terrible. And DOE can never build a construction project that costs more than $700 million in less than 16 years. I mean, if they were the private sector, everybody would go bankrupt, be out of business if we did our work like the feds. This is just more of what the independent experts said. In the interest of time, we can keep moving. This is the stated goal. I'm sorry. Obviously, pit production creates more waste. It's of a class of radioactive waste that's called transuranic. That means heavier than uranium. That basically means plutonium. And guess what? The only dump in the United States for that plutonium waste is also in New Mexico. That's the waste isolation plant down by Carlsbad. Now, an interesting fact is that expanded pit production is, and this is the Fed saying this, is going to take up 53% of available capacity at WIP. And, once again, in my view, the taxpayer is being sold a bill of goods. WIP has been advertised as enabling the cleanup of the nationwide nuclear weapons complex. But now it's going to be the repository for bomb waste for newly produced bombs. And because of that, cleanup will become less and less a priority. Now, people can get depressed when I talk. Fortunately, I seem to be incapable of depression, and I just, keep doing my thing. But something I really want to stress is that the government has tried 4 times in the past to expand pit production, and we have beat them every time. So I intentionally say that as a matter of encouragement. And part of my job as an activist is obviously to encourage other people to be activists as well. We have had major successes that, you don't hear about it on NPR, you don't hear about it on BBC, but there have been major, major victories stopping pit production, stopping new design nuclear weapons. But ironically, it all started going bad under Obama. Every time Bush, Shrub, proposed a major nuclear weapons project, we defeated it, every time. But under Obama, things started turning around. And, the irony of it, of course, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, etc. But basically, the Republicans rolled him. He started funding this so-called modernization, and now it has truly metastasized under Trump, etc. But I want to once again stress the history. Citizen action has been very successful in the past and can be again. Okay, I gotta be careful about acronyms, which is it's a job hazard. NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, often described as the cornerstone of environmental regulations in the U.S. NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, requires the federal government to offer the opportunity for public review and comment on major federal proposals. And in this case, my organization, Nuke Watch, and others, we're arguing that a programmatic review has to take place because, first of all, the feds want to raise the level of pit production, and now they're doing it at a second site, which is 1,300 miles or something like that from Los Alamos. Now, I have to remind myself of the E in NEPA is environmental, and we can force the government to conduct environmental reviews. We cannot force the government to reach the right policy decisions, but nevertheless, as an activist, I have to use what tools are available to me. So future review under the National Environmental Policy Act is crucial to point the way that things are going. The bad way is the former site of plutonium pit production, the Rocky Flats plant, which produced pits until the FBI raided it, investigating environmental crimes, and shut it down. And I know the FBI agent that led that raid. But the contamination there was awful. There are Rocky Flats people down at Los Alamos, both to produce plutonium pits and to do the cleanup. It was cleanup on the cheap at Rocky Flats. In a lot of cases, they took the most dangerous buildings, collapsed them into the basement, covered it with dirt, and that's cleanup in a lot of cases. So that's what we're facing here at Los Alamos. With, again, I'm emphasizing the fact there's Rocky Flats people on the cleanup program at Los Alamos already, and the head spokesperson for Los Alamos cleanup was the former head of cleanup at Rocky Flats. So anyway, we need to raise these things in public comment and review. For those of you who may know it, Los Alamos has just had an unbroken stream of, and this goes over decades, an unbroken stream of nuclear criticality safety incidences. And criticality is when you have too much plutonium or highly enriched uranium massed together. And it can go, it can induce a spontaneous neutron flux, which fries you. Basically, that's it. But again, even as pit production is being expanded, we have no resolution on these safety issues at Los Alamos. Now, what can be done on pit production? So here's the Democratic Party that I'm speaking to or whatever, and you will find me categorically denouncing the entire congressional delegation. And to nuance this a little bit, and I particularly say this about Ben Ray Lujan, Martin Heinrich, and Tom Udall, I think that they are some of the best congressional members in the country on everything except my issues. And when it comes to the two labs, that being Sandia and Los Alamos, and I could speak a whole nother evening on Sandia, but I'm not going to do it, okay? But it flies under the radar. But again, our congressional delegation, they are always unanimous. Anything that brings money to Los Alamos and Sandia labs, and also the waste isolation pilot plant, they are for. And, it's a crying shame because, socially, environmentally, they're pretty damn good, except on my issues, okay? So, we gotta work on them. They never have any kind of blowback or payback or whatever. The constituency, the New Mexicans, whatever, we're not aroused enough, to really bear down on our congressional delegation. And I go to Washington 3 or 4 times a year, and all I can tell you is it's important. It's important to let your congressional offices know. And it's like, I'll go to an appointment at 10 a.m. in Washington, and that particular congressional office will already know what the letters to the editor are in the New Mexican. And they pay attention to that. And one good thing about, well, there's many good things about being a New Mexican, but politically, since our population relative to other states is so small, we have far easier access to our congressional offices than, say, somebody from California would. So it makes a real difference. And then, of course, I should add that with respect to the National Nuclear Security Administration, which has an annual budget of around $12 billion for what's called for total weapons activities, 40% of that is spent in New Mexico alone. So, you know, I'm underlining the fact that we are the key state when it comes to nuclear weapons policies in the U.S. So we got to be letting our delegation know. So that's it on tip production for now. And I forgot to say, as in my self-introduction, what I really like is Q&A. So I'm trying to move through this fairly fast and look forward to Q&A. And again, urge you all to jot your questions down if you got a leaky memory like I do. Okay, now starting with cleanup. I'd like to point out the fact that as late as 1997, Los Alamos Lab was claiming in public meetings that groundwater contamination was impossible. And it was because of the impermeable volcanic tuff, over the groundwater. And groundwater at Los Alamos, on the western end, it's around 700 feet down. On the eastern end, it's about 900 feet down. But again, I like to pull the lab's chain, and you can probably tell that. This is an institution that bills itself as being the finest scientific institution in the world. It has said that sometimes. And yet, it doesn't have the smarts or the geologists or whatever to study, the ground that it's situated on. And, briefly, the Jemez Mountains are a supervolcano. They're dormant, but not extinct. And the Rio Grande is the second longest seismic rift in the world. And the Pajarito Plateau that Los Alamos sits on is regarded as one of the most geologically complex areas in the world. And this is to say it's highly fractured. So the tuff itself, yes, is pretty impermeable, but it's also highly fractured, providing pathways right down for contaminants to groundwater. So again, I'm intentionally trying to pull the lab's chain here, but for them to claim they're the world's finest scientific entity and claim that groundwater contamination is impossible, well, that illustrates how they act. They even went so far as to ask the Environment Department, the State Environment Department, for a waiver from even having to monitor groundwater contamination, which fortunately was refused. We could skip through that, but the purpose is to illustrate the complexity. This is a laboratory document. Keep going. Now this is an interesting statement by the laboratory. This was a hydrogeologic report in 2005. But notice that they pretty much paint additional contamination of groundwater as being inevitable. And that's important to know. We can pass through this one, but part of this is to illustrate that, I regard it as a lie, what the laboratory said, that groundwater contamination was impossible. And all along they actually knew better. They really did. They got the studies, etc. Okay, now I'm on to one of my pet peeves. And this is what we've got to watch out for. First of all, backing up a little bit, Los Alamos is run by the National Nuclear Security Administration. They're the weapons makers. You might remember when Los Alamos sent a bad drum of radioactive waste on Valentine's Day 2014. It ruptured underground, came up 2,100 feet contaminated 21 workers on the surface. But you know, it shut down the waste isolation pilot plant for 3 years, costing taxpayers at least $1.5 billion to reopen. But as a result, the Department of Energy actually got mad enough that it separated the cleanup contract. So the cleanup contract is now separate from the weapons making side. But the cleanup entity, they now have a Department of Energy office at Los Alamos on cleanup, and it is making the claim that cleanup at Los Alamos is more than half complete. Here's the reality, and I was able, I'm not a lawyer, but I am a wannabe. So at a public meeting, I was able to cross-examine the head of DOE Environmental Management. And on this claim of cleanup at Los Alamos being more than half complete, first of all, they started with 2,100 sites, different sites. Now, when DOE makes the claim that they're more than half complete, they have run through more than half of those sites, okay? So they're going by the number of sites, but it was completely the low-hanging fruit. Some of these sites they just had to look at and realize that nothing had to happen. So again, DOE is making this claim that cleanup is more than half complete by the number of sites. Now the danger here is that's what Congress is going to hear. And because of that, Congress won't keep, coughing up money for cleanup. Worst of all, and boy, I could go on forever, but I'm not going to. But worst of all, there was a consent order in 2005 that the Environment Department, put into place. They were sued by the Department of Energy. They held out. It was great. In 2016, the Martinez administration, after granting 150 extensions to that 2005 consent order, the Martinez administration implemented this completely toothless 2016 consent order governing cleanup. And then following that, DOE came out with this life cycle estimate of cleanup at Los Alamos. First of all, they lowballed the total cost at $3.8 billion, but they also made the claim that there are only 5,000 cubic meters of waste to be treated. And I think we got this documented later. The reality is there's 800,000 cubic yards, but meters and yards are more or less the same. There's 800,000 cubic yards of mixed toxic and radioactive waste sitting in Area G, which is the lab's largest dump. The 5,000 cubic meters that DOE is talking about is buried in Area G, but they knew they were going to have to dig that up according to promulgated environmental law. But again, my fear is this is what they're telling the appropriators. This is what they're telling Congress. We're more than half cleaned up, and we only have to clean another 5,000 cubic meters of radioactive and toxic waste. But again, by their own documents, there's 800,000 cubic yards sitting in Area G. And another way I'd like to pull their chain is the Los Alamos is very proud of having sent analytical chemistry instrumentation to Mars, in the Curiosity and the rover and all that stuff. But they don't have the will to investigate the waste that's buried in their own backyard. They don't want to know. And what they're going to do is cap and cover and just leave that stuff. And it's in unlined pits and trenches. There is no liner. There is no town in this state that can go to the state government, say we're going to open up a landfill without having liners and a leachate collection system. But this is the feds up at Los Alamos. No liners. You saw that previous quote that stated the inevitability of more contaminants hitting the groundwater. So that's the situation that we're facing. Quickly, this is area G. This is to give an idea of how big it is, 32 pits. You're going to see a picture of a pit, and they're big. I mean, they're front-end loader pits. Boom, 194 shafts, just a smorgasbord of radionuclides, solvents, et cetera, et cetera. This is merely to document what I said about 800,000. You actually see it's 844,000 cubic yards of waste at Area G. This is an extract. This is a table from a Los Alamos document. So plutonium has already migrated down 240 feet from the surface of Area G. And I repeat, they don't plan to dig this stuff up. They're going to cap and cover it and leave it forever. Groundwater in this case is about 900 feet down. So, that migration, that plutonium's already 30%. And just don't forget, the laboratory's only existed since 1943. This dump opened in 1957. So in that time, it's made that downward migration almost a third of the way to groundwater. I told you the pits are big. It's a front end loader. Those pits are close to being 3 stories in depth. You can see that. Those are like fiberglass boxes and drums. I've met, and then they run a heavy front end loader over it to compact it. And I met a Hispanic guy from Espanola who's the front end loader operator that was running over that stuff. And man, he was pro-lab and all this stuff. He came down with leukemia. Imagine running a front end loader over that stuff. This is to illustrate that genuine cleanup, they can actually do it. And MDA, by the way, again, I lapse into acronyms, but that's for material disposal area. That is to say it's a dump. But there's one old technical area, the one that's closest to the town site. They're doing a pretty thorough job of cleaning that one up, and that's because the local businesses want that area, technical area 21, to expand the town site. So where they have the will, they put up, this temporary structure to contain the contaminants. And they went in, they dug that stuff up, and they moved it on out. So it can be done. It can be done. This is an example of a modern landfill. I stated how the dump at Los Alamos, no liners, but this is in West Texas. You can see all the liners. Again, it can be done. Now, I'm headed for my close, but so again, we're facing expanded pit production. The politicos are salivating over the jobs, and we should talk about that in Q&A perhaps. But my